Hi, I'm Joe Folkman, and welcome to our webinar today. Are you really listening? A guide to tuning in and asking the right questions. Joining me today will be my partner and co-founder of Zenger Folkman, Jack Zenger. Jack, it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Joe.
I'm here. Brianne O'Corin will join us a little later in the session to make an offer to you about today's podcast. And Tracy Consolini. Tracy will be doing our chat today. Tracy is amazing at doing the chat, so feel free to ask questions. Occasionally she gets bombarded, and so if she doesn't get you an answer, eventually we will get you an answer, because she comes back to me every time and says, oh, there's a few questions that didn't get answered, and some of you really ask hard questions, so we have to think about them for a while and do some research. Well, Jack, I want to start by asking you a question. This is our most popular podcast in a long time. Why do you think this podcast has been so popular? Why is that?
Oh my, I believe that there's just this never-ending quest for getting back to the blocking and tackling of leadership, and listening skills is certainly, at the heart of all that. How a leader can truly tune into what his or her people are saying, thinking, feeling.
That is a really good answer. I thought it was our good looks and charming personality, but okay.
Oh, yeah.
Well, go ahead, Jack.
Okay, here we go. So, a few years ago, if someone had come to me and said, I've got this friend who never talks when another person is talking, never interrupts people. This person is really effective at being able to kind of sense what they're talking about. They are able to signal that they're kind of with them by the look on their face and by the ums and ahs that they are expressing as they go along. And the third kind of box there has a little note in there that talks about the fact that at the end of the discussion, they can repeat back to you almost word for word everything that you said. And if you knew a person that had those three characteristics, you would probably say, well, boy, they're probably a pretty good listener. As time went on, however, Joe and I began looking at the data that we have collected through over 1.5 million 360-degree feedback instruments. And we wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review. The article was titled, "What Great Listeners Actually Do." And we presented in there a metaphor that seemed to catch people's attention. The metaphor was that we've often thought about good leaders and good listeners as people who were good sponges. They absorbed what the other person was saying. They could repeat back word for word virtually what they said. But our data said there's more to great listening than that. And we proposed a different metaphor, and that is that great listening involves being like a trampoline, where someone brings a little bit of energy to this device, and then suddenly it's amplified, it's elevated, it's compounded. And we believe that great listening is not like, not being a sponge, but it is really serving the same purpose as a trampoline in helping the person who's being listened to expand, compound, get deeper, get broader, get more understanding. And so let me propose to you what we believe are some elements of good listening, which is kind of, we hope, a deeper dive into this topic. We have a few conversations that are with total strangers, but most of the time we're talking with people with whom we've had some interaction. And so if we have a trusting relationship with her, if our past interactions have been positive, the discussion we have is built on that past foundation of trust. The second element that we think is really important is that great listeners create a safe space. And they do this in a way by kind of framing what the conversation is going to be guided by. That is, if we talk about confidential things, that those confidences will be protected. They spell out the time frame. How much time do we have for this discussion that we're about to have? What are just the general understandings and ground rules? The third point is that the effective listening means that we remove distractions. Nothing signals listening more than the person who reaches over to his or her laptop and closes it, which really sends the message, I'm not going to be distracted. I'm not going to hear any pings about new emails coming in. I'm not going to sneak a glance over to see what's going on my screen. I'm really going to focus my attention with you. And there are other distractions, obviously, that are around. But effective listening means creating the context for having a great discussion with somebody. The fourth point, I guess, is that we would focus on the substance and the emotion. Most ideas have wrapped around them almost like a hot dog bun wraps around a hot dog, wraps around some emotion about that. So good listening involves not only being able to reflect on the substance of the conversation, but also it means paying attention to the emotions that are around it, whether they be positive, pleasant, hopeful, exciting, or whether they be kind of troubled, angry, difficult ones. And so while we're still on that point number 4, let me just say that we often think of listening being primarily something you do with your ears, but let me propose that it's also something you do with your eyes. That as you look at the other person, as you look at their respiration rate, as you look at their blotches on their skin, or you see them perspiring, or there are all kinds of signals that people send as you converse with them that telegraph the emotion about this subject. The fifth point that I'd like to mention is about active listening is that it's a two-way dialogue. And I've suggested here that it's a tennis game or a table tennis game, not a golf round. And by that, I mean that things go back and forth. It's not like a golfer who hits his or her own ball and nobody else touches theirs. There's no reciprocity at all in this. Good listening is in just the opposite. It's very much a back and forth between the two individuals, the people the person who is being listened to and the person who is presenting their ideas. The sixth point we'd like to emphasize is that good listening is a positive experience for both people. It's a positive experience for the person being listened to because it lifts them up. It builds their self-esteem that you have paid this focused attention to them. And it's a positive experience for the coach or the person who is the listener, because they are gaining understanding and knowledge, and they're creating a greater bond with this person. Which leads us to point number 7. And that is one of the great skills of listening is that an effective listener, by having this back and forth with the person who is speaking, they ask questions which brings the conversation into focus on, as one of our colleagues said, what's the real question? What's the elephant in the room? What is the real crux of this matter? And great listeners have this wonderful ability to kind of hear the bigger picture, the deeper issue, and to focus the conversation on that. And finally, what this does is that both parties then leave having an expanded understanding of what the issues are, what the opportunities are, and of each other, which lays then the foundation and the groundwork for the next conversation that they're going to have, which increases this level of trust and compatibility with these two people. So as we move on then, what are the payoffs of active listening? Well, we're going to talk about three of them. The payoff to how it impacts employee engagement, people that work with you, how it impacts their level of confidence in the management of their organization, and how it impacts people's feeling of about being better informed. So Joe, go through the data with our listeners.
Well, it wouldn't be a Zenger Folkman webinar with without a bunch of graphs. So here we go. What we're looking at here is data from about 3,455 leaders. They were all measured on 360-degree feedback, where one of the competencies that were measured was how well they listened. And then we actually asked their direct reports some questions about their level of engagement. Are they satisfied? Are they engaged? Do they love their job? Are they thinking about quitting? So as you see there, the horizontal axis shows the effectiveness of the direct reports on listening. The vertical axis measures engagement. And as you can see, poor listeners, the engagement level is down at the 28th percentile, very low. A good listener is the 52nd percentile on engagement, but great listeners have in direct reports, just those direct reports there at the 76th percentile. So again, being a great listener really creates a positive climate, a positive atmosphere for the employees. The second thing it is, we ask those direct reports if they were confident that they'll be treated fairly, right? Are you confident that you'll be treated fairly? And again, there's a real strong correlation between the extent to which that leader listens and the extent to which people say, yes, I will be treated fairly. I know this is a fair organization. But listening has a lot to do with that feeling that you're not going to take advantage of me or you're not going to abuse me. The third thing we measured was I'm being well informed. Now, you'd think that what would move well informed was the extent to which you talked a lot, right? I mean, that's what well informed is. But it turns out, yes, you do have to talk some, but those leaders that talked and listened, in other words, they said something, but then said, do you have any questions? Or is this confusing in any way? When they did both, that really helped the perception of the direct reports in terms of this leader keeps us or it helps us to be well informed. So there's some positive outcomes from being a good listener as a leader.
So the question arises, what produces these positive outcomes? And our belief is that, one very important element is that the other person knows that the listener cares and truly wants to help them. And that message comes through loud and clear, and it produces those results that Joe just covered. What's fascinating is that a lot of what makes that happen are the kinds of questions that the supposed listener asks in the course of the conversation. The questions you ask really do a lot of the heavy lifting of making listening really work. Questions convey your empathy, your understanding of them, and your desire to understand them. And they have a very strong, very positive effect in building the relationship between you and the person to whom you're listening. The next thing, I must confess that when we were thinking about doing this webinar, we debated a little bit. Do we call it listening or do we call it asking questions? And, we concluded that you really are talking about two sides of the same coin. These are inextricably kind of linked together. The listening and asking questions just are two peas in a pod, and they must be kind of looked at together in order for each of them to make the greatest sense. So in thinking about, what we know about questions, here are the questions that I guess a lot of us would have about questions. What are the benefits of asking questions? Are there different kinds of questions, different types of questions that people can ask? And if so, what are the most powerful of those questions that people kind of can ask? And in general, how can we help leaders practice more inquiry and more discovery and less of what some have described as advocacy? Many times leaders believe that their role is to always be the advocate of some position, some idea, some new campaign, some proposal, some new project. But the evidence is that the most effective leaders are also very good at practicing inquiry and helping to discover what's going on about them, and not always just being focused on being advocates. So one of the things that we're going to emphasize in today's webinar is this need for balancing what some would think of as listening and talking. And it's important to develop the ideal balance. Early in my career, I worked in a company where the leaders were very, very bright, very well-educated biochemists, chemists, pharmaceutical scientists. And there was one colleague that had an interesting reputation. People needed to talk to him because he was in a crucial role. But you knew that if you went into his office to talk, that you could look at your watch and assume that the first 45 minutes, literally, would be him basically musing about something that he had been contemplating, kind of giving you a soliloquy about some important topic in his mind. And you just kind of, this was the entry price, a 45-minute kind of period of time of basically listening to him. And then he would kind of wind down and you would begin to have a conversation. Unfortunately, a lot of people err on the side of talking too much and don't have the optimum balance of talking, stopping, and really then listening to what's the outcome of these questions and conversations we're having. I saw an interesting suggestion somebody had, and that was on the top of their notepad, they would write the word wait, W-A-I-T. But that was for them an acronym of, why am I talking? Why is it that when I'm in the middle of a meeting that I end up kind of commanding most of the airtime? And I would invite all of you to kind of think about that wonderful acronym. Why am I talking? If I am talking to ask a good question, that's a good reason. And that's a valuable reason and a valuable behavior in being a good listener. But if you think you're on the side of, boy, I take way more than my share of the airtime, then think hard about the balance that you want to have between talking and so-called listening practices. In diving into this question about what are the best kinds of questions and why do we ask questions, all of us are familiar with the most frequently asked question that occurs between people, and that's, how are you? How are you doing? And And in reality, we both know that I really don't want a detailed description of your physical health at the moment. I don't want to know about all your aches and pains and you're going to the dentist and whatever. It's a question we ask, which is just kind of a way of bonding, of connecting. It's kind of like dogs meet and they sniff, and it isn't a particularly helpful kind of question. But the second reason that we ask questions, I think, is that it conveys that we're prepared. I mean, all of us have watched television shows where the interviewer, the anchor of the news show is interviewing someone, and they've obviously read their book. They've thought about what they've been saying and speaking about. And so good questions convey your preparation. And the third thing they do is that they convey your credibility. They give you, kind of a license to be inquiring about a given topic. And of course, the fourth reason, for the reason why we ask questions, is that we truly want to gain new information. We value the information that this person has, and we ask questions that we can understand what they're thinking and why they're thinking it, and what's happened in their life that causes them to have this point of view. So indeed, there's different kinds of questions, and we clearly are going to suggest that there are some things that make better questions and some things that make not so good questions. And the more you can move away from just the how are you doing kind of question, the better off you're going to be. Good questions convey a positive intent, and they help to focus the conversation. That's one of the things that good leaders and good listeners really do. The second thing is that it moves the conversation towards the crux of the matter, towards the real question. And so to the degree that you can think about the questions you ask and the degree to which they help move the dialogue to the center, to the crux, to the heart, that becomes a better question. Good questions expand both parties' understanding of the issue. In our programs on teaching people how to be better coaches, we've said that good coaching involves helping the person being coached to have a better understanding of the issues that they face, to discover for themselves the answers to their challenges, to their questions and their problems, but to enlarge their understanding of that. And so this dialogue can have this very important effect. And one of the techniques that really seems to be extremely valuable in doing that is when you ask second level questions. The person says something, it triggers something in your mind, it triggers a deeper question in your mind. You go the next level, you peel back one more layer of the onion, and you go deeper, and that's what really helps the individual to whom you're listening, and helps you as the listener to really understand the situation. And finally, what we would suggest is often asking for specificity, asking for examples. Helps move the discussion, move the dialogue away from just broad abstractions and just general blather. And by asking for examples and asking for specificity, that's what often makes some of the best questions. All right. So Joe, tell them about the interesting findings in our data.
Jack, we had some interesting studies. The first one we compared males against females, and it looked about the same, except the males were a little higher. No one could believe that because it didn't seem to make any sense, especially to our female companions. But then we did a random sample of that, and it wasn't significant. So we're not showing you that study, but maybe there's a chance that males listen pretty good. I don't know. If you look at this first graph and you look at all the functions in the company, who's the better listeners? And sales leads the way. And boy, that makes sense, right? They're taught, they're schooled, they're given a lot of insight to listen to the customer, and you need to be close to the customer. And then it's no surprise that customer service would be second highest on that. It surprised us when we found research and development was high. But as you think about what they're doing and they're pushing boundaries and everything, they really have to do a lot of good listening. And is this what we want? And that kind of thing. HR comes in fourth place, general management. Now, if you look at the bottom there, you find engineering and operations and quality management. And again, maybe they could improve a little bit. There's more tell than listen there. And so those are the functions that are not as good at listeners. When we looked at age, we found an interesting process that said, as age increases, listening declines. So Jack, as you see the end of that graph there at 61, it bops up a little bit. Maybe there's a chance for us, all right?
Yeah.
But why do you think that is? Why does listening go down as people age?
Boy, I wish I knew. I think it's easy to be a little bit calloused and say, "Oh my, I've heard this before. I've been down that road." And I think as we get older, there's a tendency for complacency, maybe a little more arrogance setting in. I'm hoping that when you get up into the 70s and 80s and 90s, though, that trend goes away.
There you go. We can only hope.
I hope.
But if you want to stand out and you're older, one way to stand out a lot is to listen. Now, here's the scary one. If we look at it by management levels, and top management, lowest score, 39th percentile, senior management, 42nd, middle managers, 49th. That is scary. What is it, Jack, that causes senior managers to not listen as well?
Well, and there may be a bit of this age factor. I mean, it's probably correct that senior managers tend to be older and top management. And so maybe it's being impacted a bit by the age phenomenon. And again, this, like I told you this story about this colleague I worked with for many years. I think he really thought that it was his obligation to kind of advocate and to, when you came into his office, to kind of give a speech to you. And I think in recent years, our conceptions of management have changed. We've gone to a more, participative kind of management, and not so autocratic, not authoritarian. But a little bit of that still lives on.
It does. And so advice here, if you want to stand, if you want to stand out as a senior leader, as top manager, listen a little bit more. Okay, so as you did your self-assessment, we did that assessment, and we measured you on your preferences for listening or for talking. We actually got data from, and I looked at this earlier, I had 236 of you, and your average score on listening was 5.57. It was a positive score. And so it looks like a lot of the people on this webinar are already good listeners, or at least they responded that way. We actually had 23% of the people that did the survey got a perfect +10 score on listening. Now, if you got a negative score, what it shows is that your preferences is more of telling or helping, advising, giving information. I mean, and a lot of people that got a negative score, they'll say, well, you know, I really care a lot about people. I want to help them. Well, you tend to talk a lot, right? And so that's the insight there. So that's your preference, okay? And everybody says, well, does preference predict effectiveness? So in this score here, in this graph here, what we're showing you is a study that we did with about 200 leaders where we measured their preference for talk or listen, and their effectiveness at listening is measured by a 360 assessment. And as you can see there, if your preference was to talk a little bit more, -10 to 0, their listening score was only at the 32nd percentile. If their score was 1 to 6, they were at the 47th percentile. And if their score was 7 or higher, they were at the 56th percentile as assessed by others on the 360. So we feel there's some validity to this self-assessment test that can help people understand how they're doing at talking or listening.
So would like to ask you to respond to this poll, if you would. What actions and attitudes could help you to be a better listener? And in this case, you don't have to choose one or the other. Mark all that you think apply. So we'll wait a minute or two here and give you a chance to kind of weigh in. And what do you think helps people to be a better listener?
What do you think is going to be the winning one here?
Well, I think number 2, seeking a more positive relationship with the other person is going to be one that will, I think the one that will get the lowest score will be the one about either seeking information contrary to my current thinking or wanting feedback to guide my development. Anyway, we'll see. All right. Well, we hope most of you have had a chance to kind of weigh in. So, Terry, you can show us the results.
Oh, wow.
Oh, look at that. Oh, so being interested in, it looks like maybe seeking to discover what others believe and think as they do. Well, thank you very much for responding to these questions. In a way, this was a little bit of a setup for what comes next in our discussion, because what Joe and I have done is to look at what are the behaviors that the people who got the highest scores on as being good listeners, great listeners, what did they do? And what we found was that there were indeed 5 things that they did, and they're kind of repeated in what you just responded to. They were, as you see, those 5 icons there, interested in the development of others, building relationships, and you see them. And so what we'd like to do now is to talk about these, we've called them strength builders, because these become kind of powerful opportunities for us to maybe improve our listening skills and our listening behavior. The first one is having a genuine interest in developing other people. You know, there's something about me being interested in you and your future and your career that's a very powerful opportunity for practicing listening. Because on one hand, it signals my interest and my intent about wanting to be helpful to you and mentoring you in your career. But it's also the content of the discussion is powerful because it's content that is almost always pretty interesting to the person you're talking with, because it's their career, it's their future that you're focused on. And so the practice of having periodic discussions with people about their future and their development is a great laboratory for you to practice improving listening behavior. It's a great vehicle.
The second one is builds relationships. Now, imagine that you're with your boss and your boss is really listening. Really, they're nodding their head, they're asking good questions. But you think, you don't like me. I think you're out to get me. And so, as you think about the relationship and the behavior of listening, if somebody's listening to you, but they don't like you, you're probably saying, so are you trying to manipulate me? Are you trying to mess with me? Right? There is something very special about having a positive relationship and how that influences how people feel about that listening experience. Now, what we found is this works both ways. We found that people who listen well actually are rated much higher on their ability to build positive relationships with others. It's a great skill at building the relationship, but also people that listen or have good relationships are perceived as better listeners. Again, having that positive relationship sets it up for you to have a really good listening experience. And so if you don't have a good relationship with someone, they may not think you're really trying to listen to them.
The third thing our research showed was that really excellent listeners were curious. They really loved getting a better understanding about other people. Now, it happens that I'm married to a person who has a very broad intellectual curiosity. She is interested in virtually everything, whether it's volcanoes in Iceland or Egyptian pyramids or World War II or anything on a science documentary. And I have come to believe that you can foster your own curiosity by paying attention to new ideas, new things. That curiosity. There's an old Swedish proverb that says, "With the eating comes the appetite." I think the more you delve into what other people are doing, their past, their beliefs, their ideas, people with different educational backgrounds than you have, there's curiosity feeds on itself. And we learn through our curiosity and willingness to ask good questions. But just practicing curiosity is a strength builder for effective listening.
The fourth one is around asking for and acting on feedback from others. What's interesting about this is that we think this is a super behavior. A lot of times organizations have a precedent of it's the boss who's going to give feedback and you are supposed to sit there and accept the feedback. But what we found is that, the research says that over 80% of the time, or I'm sorry, 38% of the time, that doesn't work. The feedback you give isn't accepted. It's not understood. It's a negative experience, and you go through this amygdala hijack where you get defensive. Asking for feedback is a sign of humility. It's a sign of that you care about what that other person thinks. And it really sets up a very strong situation when you ask for feedback, that people really believe you want to hear from them. You really care about what they have to say. Now, also, you might hear something that's very helpful for you. We found that people that ask for feedback more tend to be better leaders because you hear things that help you to be more effective. This is a great skill to develop.
And the fifth and final strength builder is practicing inclusion and valuing diversity in your life. So when you include in your circle of colleagues and friends, people who differ in age, gender, race, ideology, philosophy, educational background, this becomes then a wonderful test kitchen for you to practice your listening skills. Nothing is more fascinating than really trying to understand how someone who has a different political philosophy or religious perspective, or who has a different scientific background than you do, understanding their thinking and their ideas is a wonderful exercise in being a better listener. It is the ultimate test kitchen. And so practice finding people who are not exactly like you and reading things that are not the typical thing that you would normally be reading. These are all ways that you become open to new ideas, become a better listener. All right, Joe.
Well, in the self-assessment, Jack, we ask people to rate their level of effectiveness on these 5 strength builders. And on your feedback, it gives you the scores for each. Now, as you look down the scores, of course, a high score means you feel like you're very good at it. A low score might indicate that this is a weakness or you need to fix this. We also ask you to rate your level of effectiveness on listening. And this gives you your effectiveness score on listening. And again, the first thing we ask you, or we looked at your preference for talking or listening. This is your effectiveness at listening. And you can see how effective you rated yourself at listening. You can compare yourself against norms. We've given the average scores for over 4,000 leaders there, and you can see where the averages are. I was really interested to see on when I looked at your data, the data that you guys have put in the system, that your average scores were all very conservative. You kind of weren't overrating yourselves for the most part. The lowest score on these 5 behaviors was asking for an acts on feedback from others. So that tends to be something that people don't do as often. Now, how do you think about this feedback and what might you do to become a better listener? Because one of the things we want to do in this webinar is have you walk away with an action plan. So the first idea is that you might have something we call a fatal flaw. Now, a fatal flaw is something you're very bad at. And if one of those 5 things is a fatal flaw, your average effectiveness at listening is at the 28th percentile. So it's really going to hurt you. And I'd strongly encourage you, if one of these is a fatal flaw, to really work on it. And we're going to give you a development guide to help you improve that. Now, for most people, they think, oh, all these 5 things are important. I'll just try to get better at them. So I'll work on 1, and then I'll work on 2, and I'll work on 3, and I'll work on 4. And you can see the effect of being above average on these. And that's intuitively oftentimes the way people think about improvement, is it's like, I've got to be perfect at everything. And so they work on their least positive thing and they move it up, and then they work on the next least positive thing. Over time, they become just better. And it does help your effectiveness at listening to work on the weaknesses. But another approach that we prefer is building strengths. So look what happens if you're just really good at one of the 5 skills. Your average effectiveness at listening goes up to the 71st percentile. If you're really good at 2, it goes up to the 82nd percentile. And if you're really good at 3, it goes up to the 86th percentile. Our preferred approach here is to suggest that the way for you to improve might be to select one of these. If you don't have a fatal flaw, select one of these to become a profound strength. And so, Jack, explain how they might select.
Well, the filters we would suggest is, first of all, did you have a really low score on any one of the strength building behaviors? And as Joe has suggested, if you do, that may be the place to start. But secondly, would improving that behavior have a significant positive impact on my performance in my current job? And if that's the case, then that's even more reinforcement for doing that. And are you reasonably passionate about improving that behavior? Then that's a good way to go about selecting which one you work on. But if not, then as Joe said, look at the one that you think you're relatively good at, but if you could push it up to being one of your real strengths, then you begin to move into those 70th and 80th and 90, 80, high 80 percentile scores. So Joe and I are always curious about, after you've heard our discussion of these things, which of those strength builders would you choose to work on? Which ones seem to have the most meaning for you? So if you would just, there were 5 of them. If you wouldn't mind weighing in, so just letting us know which one can't kind of rang a bell as far as you were concerned in terms of helping you become an even more effective listener.
So Jack asks for and acts on feedback. That was the lowest rated. You think that's going to get the most votes? I think curiosity is going to get the most votes.
Well, I kind of think you're, oh boy. Yeah, I think you're right. Let's see. All right, let us know the answers.
Well,
Okay.
it's pretty close.
Curiosity, asking questions was number 1, it looks like, and yeah.
Number 2 was relationships. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks very much for weighing in on that. As you saw, as you've heard, as you take the exit survey, you will have downloaded to you our development guide regarding active listening. So now we want to toss the microphone. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's a quotation from Larry King. Did he recently just pass away? I think maybe he did.
He did.
We love this quote from him, though. He said, I remind myself every morning, nothing I say this day will teach me anything. So if I'm going to learn, I must do it by listening. And he made his livelihood by listening to people.
He was a great listener.
All right. So Bree.
Yes, thank you, Jack and Joe. I gained a lot from listening to this webinar. As I was thinking about it, leadership is really it's about the conversations that we are having, and all of the data that Jack and Joe shared throughout this webinar about how we are, as people age, we're not getting better at these skills. And if you think about these conversations, they're becoming less productive and less balanced. And you add to that remote work, and now all those conversations that are not happening in person, we're not getting nonverbal cues. And so I think there definitely is room for improvement in all of our lives. And we've seen that from the interest in this webinar in becoming better listeners. And we need to evaluate the conversations that we're having. Are they about issuing orders and taking those orders, or are they focused on listening and asking questions? So we know active listening is such an important skill that aligns people. The webinar that you saw today is a shorter preview of a much larger session that we've built that's around 90 plus minutes for organizations. If what you heard and the assessment that you took really interest you, we invite you to bring this microlearning session to your organization, we have a special offer going on right now. As you can see on the slide there, you can have any 2 sessions from our catalog. If you go on to zengerfolkman.com and look at our microlearning sessions, you can see all of the different leadership skills that we offer there. If you're interested in this, on our exit survey, you can indicate your interest and we'll have a salesperson talk to you more about this particular session that you experienced today. As always, we love to hear your feedback to know what we can do to make these webinars more productive and interesting and helpful. So if you'll go to the next slide, Joe, you can see that we have our exit survey. One of the best things that you'll receive from this session today is that development guide for listening that we have created. So if you complete the exit survey, you can see that bit.ly link right there. And also you can find it in the chat. You will receive that development guide. Thank you for joining us on this webinar today, and we hope to see you next month.